Welcome to Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center's Programming for LGBT History Month. And we're here today with Faye Jacobs, who has a wonderful program here for us this evening. Our LGBT cultural programs are brought to our community thanks in part to a grant from the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, the federal state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And also thanks to a grant from Air Products. We're so grateful for our supporters who have made these virtual programs possible during COVID-19. And these programs are free for our entire community. However, for anyone in our community who is in a position to donate, we invite you to donate either on Facebook Live or at bradburysullivancenter.org/donate. And with that, please join me in welcoming Faye Jacobs.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Faye Jacobs, and I'm happy to be with you at this time to share some basic 101 gay history. None of us learn these stories in school, and I hope some information will be new to you and inspire you and catch you up on the LGBTQ culture and history that your teachers had nothing to do with. So obviously, let me just say that queer people have been here since the Stone Age. As a matter of fact, in 1719, in the colonies that would become America, including my home in Delaware, same-sex relations, misnamed sodomy, it was a crime punishable by death. Ow! And in the 1800s, it was called the love that dare not speak its name. Lots of people did speak its name, notably poet Walt Whitman and writer Oscar Wilde. Now, Wilde's snarky quotes made him a role model for witty gay men everywhere. Wilde said things like, "Be yourself, everyone else is already taken," or "True friends stab you in the front." And famously, he said, "I can resist everything but temptation." He would have been great in the center square on Hollywood squares. But for this presentation, I want to share our more recent history from the 1950s forward, when gays started to reveal themselves, making strides toward securing civil rights in the United States. Now first, pretty much first, there was Haye Jr. Ever heard of him? In the 1950s in Los Angeles, gay rights activist Haye Jr. shocked people for being the very first to publicize the radical notion that homosexuals were an oppressed minority entitled to equal rights. Can you imagine such heresy? Let me say, he didn't help his cause because he dressed oddly and proclaimed Communist Party membership, and he said outrageous things, like gays had rights. He was investigated by the government as a nutcase. Now, Haye had many homosexual affairs, and most notably a relationship with actor Will Geer. Anybody know Will Geer? He was grandpa on the Waltons. By 1950, Haye co-founded America's first sustained national gay rights organization, the secret homophile group, the Mattachine Society. Weird name, I know. It was a medieval French term to describe naughty male jesters, kind of like a bunch of Randy Rainbows. Now, Haye and the Mattachine aimed to change public perception of homosexuality, eliminate all discrimination, and assimilate into mainstream society. It was the 1950s. Good luck with that. At the time, it was illegal in California for more than 2 homosexuals to gather. I don't know what they thought 3 or 4 could do that 2 couldn't do, but that was the law. So 7 men took a vow of secrecy and met. Although Haye was known as an intellectual bully, the group flourished and grew. Their publication, One, the homosexual magazine, was the first widely distributed magazine for homosexuals and was sent through the mail in plain brown wrappers. In 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower signed an executive order banning homosexuals from working for the federal government or any of its private contractors. The order lists homosexuals as security risks, along with, here you go, alcoholics and total neurotics. In a well-known story, a member of the Women's Air Corps, Sergeant Johnny Phelps, was tasked by Eisenhower to assist in ferreting out lesbians in the Corps. Her reply was, yes, I will be happy to make a list of lesbians in the Corps, but the first name on it shall be mine. Eisenhower's secretary jumped in saying, if the general pleases, my name will be first and hers will be second. Eisenhower did not fire either one of them. In San Francisco in 1955, the Daughters of Bilitis became the first lesbian rights organization in the United States. I always thought Bilitis sounded like a terrible disease. Others must have agreed because most people simply called it the DOB. Actually, the name was based on a poem about a fictional lover of the poet Sappho living on the Greek isle of Lesbos. So Bilitis it was. The group was founded by a lesbian couple, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons, to host social functions and as an alternative to lesbian bars, which were frequently raided with the women arrested, their names published in the newspaper, and it usually led to the loss of their job and many times their children and families. In 1956, the DOB published the first issue of their newsletter, The Ladder, which was the first lesbian publication in the US. Its aim was to reach out to isolated lesbians, letting them know they were not alone. Considering the era, there were articles in The Ladder from attorneys and psychiatrists, and even one about raising children even though, quote, a parent is a deviant, unquote. Nice. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., astronomer Frank Kameny started a Washington chapter of Mattachine. Kameny had been fired from his government job with the U.S. Map Service in 1957 because he was suspected of being gay. He appealed the firing, and though he lost that appeal, the suit was the very first known civil rights claim based on homosexuality. In 1958, the Mattachine's magazine, One, was sued by the Postal Service as obscene. The Supreme Court, in its first ruling in favor of the queer community, said that it had First Amendment rights and could be distributed through the mail. Recipients still demanded plain brown wrappers, of course. In the late 40s through the 50s, almost 5,000 gay men and women were discharged from the military and around 500 fired from government jobs. The purge was known as the Lavender Scare. Frank Kameny had guts and fought back. Under his direction, the DC Mattachine Society was the first organization to protest the systematic persecution of gay federal employees. A Senate report came out with the official title, wait for it, quote, Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government, unquote. So it went to Congress so that the government could root out and fire all queers. It reported homosexuality as a mental illness, saying homos were security risks and lacked the stability of normal persons. This reminds me of writer Dorothy Parker, who said, quote, heterosexuality is not normal, it's just common, unquote. In 1961, Kameny and colleagues organized some of the earliest public protests by homosexuals, picketing in DC and Philadelphia. They struck the White House in 1965. Kameny asked picketers to dress nicely, men in suits and ties, women in dresses and high heels, to, as he said, look respectable in public. One of the picketers was a woman named Barbara Giddings, head of the Philly chapter of DOB, who later became editor of The Ladder magazine. Then, in 1966, came an action of civil disobedience at the Julius Bar in New York's Greenwich Village. Taking a page from civil rights sit-ins in the South, Mattachine members held what they called a sip-in at the bar. You see, New York Liquor Authority prohibited serving drinks to gay patrons, saying that homosexuals are disorderly. So one night, some guys came into the bar, shouted out that they were homosexuals, and after a bit of commotion, the bartenders refused to serve them. Somebody called the newspapers, photos were taken, and the Mattachine Society sued the Liquor Authority. The New York City Commission on Human Rights took their side, amazingly, and declared that homosexuals had the right to be served. Next time you have a drink at a bar, thank Frank Kameny and his buddies. In breaking news, I want to say that Julius, the bar, is still there after more than 50 years, but it has been closed since March due to the pandemic. They are now doing a GoFundMe campaign to raise money and try to reopen. The future is looking tenuous. Now, most people probably think that the 1969 Stonewall Riots, they think of it as the beginning of the fight for gay rights, but it really happened in 1966 when the transgender community at Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco first came out swinging. Now, Compton's was a welcoming place for drag queens and many trans women. One night, several transgender customers, known as the Screaming Queens, had a little too much loud fun, and management called the police. When a police officer roughed up one of the patrons, she threw coffee in his face, and it became a riot, eventually spilling out into the street, destroying police cars and public property. Not a single newspaper dared to cover the story, which is why no one knows the exact date of this event. Imagine a huge two-night street riot between police and citizens not reported because, as the Advocate magazine recently wrote, LGBT people were so odious back then, even in peace and love San Francisco, that the street battle needed to be kept from innocent eyes. Then, in November 1969, lesbians were loudly unwelcome at the first Congress to Unite Women. Author and National Organization of Women President Betty Friedan pitched a fit and called the presence of lesbian feminists the Lavender Menace. They exiled lesbians from the entire women's movement. Friedan believed outspoken lesbians would somehow taint NOW and the feminist cause. Friedan didn't want mannish or man-hating lesbians to spoil their reputation. Young activist and later author Rita Mae Brown was so pissed off she resigned her full-time job at NOW and began strategizing to get back at Friedan and her heterosexual cronies. We'll get back to that. Then, on June 28, 1969, 51 years ago, came the infamous Stonewall Riots. Patrons of the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village rioted when police raided the popular gay bar. Young homeless white boys, gay people of color, and a few tough lesbians were there, including heroes like Marsha P. Johnson, a 25-year-old trans woman of color, and Sylvia Rivera, a Puerto Rican drag queen. Marsha may well have started the whole thing when, as she was being escorted out to the paddy wagon, she climbed a lamppost and dropped a heavy bag onto the hood of the police car, shattering the windshield. She shouted, "Somebody do something," as she was thrown into the police wagon. People did something. Drag queen Mary Queen of Scots didn't go quietly. Neither did the hot young guys and their sugar daddies and other patrons. After struggling to empty the bar, some police officers got trapped inside when patrons slammed the front doors on them. Protesters started throwing firebombs into the building, which almost led to a terrible tragedy. The protest led to a 3-day riot, during which thousands of protesters received only minimal local coverage in the newspapers, with insulting headlines like, "Queen bees are stinging mad." Nevertheless, the event is credited with reigniting the fire behind Americans' modern gay rights movement. 1 year later, June 28, 1970, came the first march through New York City in what is now considered America's first gay pride parade. Meanwhile, in 1970, the so-called Lesbian Menace started their own organization of the same name. Still pissed off for being bumped from the women's movement, 40 members of the Lesbian Menace showed up at the Second Congress to Unite Women, sponsored by Now. They stormed the stage. They stormed the stage at the women's movement, at the Second Congress, with signs saying things like "Super Dyke loves you" and "Take a lesbian to lunch," advocating lesbian rights despite the Congress's official attempt to reclaim the stage. The Lavender Menace turned the program into a frank discussion of lesbians and their rights. The rebellion was effective, and the women of the Lavender Menace kept the pressure on Main Street feminism, resulting in Now eventually adopting lesbian rights policies. Meanwhile, in 1971, our friend Barbara Giddings, gay task force and DOB member, along with colleagues from the American Library Association, staged a kissing booth in the library conference in Dallas. They offered kisses from lesbians and proclaimed "Hug a homosexual" in order to raise funds for the ALA. Barbara and writer Isabel Miller demonstrated how lesbians kissed. Their photo made the papers. Naturally, it was absolutely scandalous. Many of those activists, led by Giddings, also tried to get the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. Ironically, many members of the association were gay psychiatrists themselves. One of them, a well-respected doctor, wanted to speak out, but knew it would end his career if he came out as gay. So he went to the APA meeting and testified with, and this is totally true, he went with a brown paper bag over his head with cutouts for his eyes, nose, and mouth. He made a plea, slightly muffled from behind the brown bag, for removing homosexuality as a diagnosis of mental illness. He was so persuasive that in 1973, the board of the APA voted that homosexuality was no longer to be considered a mental illness to be cured. It was an enormous leap forward for LGBT rights. Then gay rights became all about orange juice. Anybody know why? Anita Bryant. Now, Anita Bryant was a former beauty queen, a so-so singer, and a conservative Southern Baptist and spokeswoman for the Florida citrus industry, and one of the first people to organize an anti-gay rights organization. In 1977, she led the Save Our Children crusade to repeal a gay rights ordinance in Dade County. She famously said, "If gays are granted rights, we'll have to give rights to prostitutes and people who sleep with St. Bernards." I have no words. Sadly, she won and the ordinance was repealed. But she faced a serious backlash from gay rights supporters, and she once had a pie thrown in her face. The gay rights activist, whose name was Tom Higgins, who threw the pie, laughed, and he said he made sure it was a fruit pie. Sadly, it was another 20 years before Dade County, Florida, had a pro-gay rights ordinance. Also in 1977, Harvey Milk, a gay New Yorker, transplanted to California and known as the mayor of Castro Street, won a seat on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. During his campaign, he excelled at registering voters, and he responded to Anita Bryant's false charge that homosexuals recruited children by loving to say, "I'm Harvey Milk and I'm here to recruit you," to register to vote, that is. He was wildly popular in the queer community, and he introduced gay rights legislation in California and also led a successful campaign against something called Proposition 6, an initiative that sought to keep homosexuals from being teachers at all. Tragically, just a year later, he was shot to death by former city supervisor Dan White. Dan White had been fired by the mayor of San Francisco, and the mayor, George Moscone, was killed that day too. That's when now Senator Dianne Feinstein became mayor and had to break the tragic news to the media. When, a year later, White was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to only 7 years in prison, gays were outraged by what they believed to be a lenient sentence. That night, more than 5,000 protesters ransacked San Francisco City Hall, doing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage. It spilled out into the streets and the surrounding areas. Following that terrible night, approximately 10,000 people gathered on San Francisco's Castro Street for a peaceful demonstration to commemorate what would have been Harvey Milk's 49th birthday. Please watch the movie Milk, starring Sean Penn. It's quite amazing. Now, on October 14th, 1979, it was really time to bust down the closet door. An estimated 75,000 people participated in the first National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. Gay people and straight allies demanded equal civil rights and urged passage of protective civil rights legislation. I was just coming out of the closet myself then, and I wasn't brave enough to march in person. But I read about the event in the Washington Post, and I saw the images in print and on TV of drag queens in feathers, topless dykes on bikes, and men wearing nothing but chaps. The media only reported on the sensational, but things were moving in a positive direction. But by July 3rd, 1981, the trouble began. The New York Times printed the first story of a rare pneumonia and skin cancer found in 41 gay men in New York and California. The CDC initially referred to the disease as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency disorder. When the symptoms were found outside the gay community, Bruce Voller, biologist and founder of the National Gay Task Force, successfully lobbied to change the name of the disease to AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Anti-gay discrimination rose as thousands of young gay men got sick and quickly died. The AIDS epidemic tore through the gay male communities with no offer of help or assistance from any government official or President Ronald Reagan or anyone. Gays had to learn to take care of their own, with many lesbians coming together with their brothers to care for those dying of AIDS. And it brought the queer community together like nothing ever had before. Thankfully, as we know, there are now drugs to make AIDS and HIV manageable and not a certain death sentence. But in the early 80s, it was the plague. If you've seen the film The Normal Heart, it gives a moving and dramatic view of the epidemic and of Larry Kramer, playwright and activist who played an enormous role in warning gay men to stay safe. The advocacy group ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was formed by Larry Kramer and his friends in response to the devastating effects of the disease on the community. The group held demonstrations against pharmaceutical companies profiteering from AIDS-related drugs, as well as the lack of AIDS policies protecting patients from outrageous prescription prices. On October 11th, 1987, hundreds of thousands of activists and LGBT citizens and their allies took part in the National March for Life in Washington to demand that President Reagan address the AIDS crisis and fight for gay rights. It was a colossal march, with activists gathering on the National Mall to walk through acres and acres of haunting panels of the AIDS quilt, remembering those who had died. I was there, marching with my partner Bonnie and friends, and sadly paying tribute to some who were no longer with us. It was one of the most moving, empowering, harrowing, and memorable days of my entire life. And I think it was a turning point. Bill Clinton became president in 1992, and by the following year, the Department of Defense issued a directive prohibiting the U.S. military from barring applicants from the service based on their sexual orientation. Applicants shall not be asked or required to reveal whether they are homosexual, stated the policy, which still forbade applicants from engaging in homosexual acts or outing themselves. The policy was known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and it was pretty much a flop. Gay military personnel still were discriminated against and discharged in horrific numbers. In 1996 came a terrible piece of legislation. After much anti-gay hate spewing around the country about the fight for gay marriage, Congress enacted the Defense of Marriage Act, defining marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman. President Clinton criticized the act as unnecessary, but fearing a movement for a constitutional amendment defining it marriage as one man, one woman, he ultimately signed it, causing a major roadblock in the just begun fight for marriage equality, one which would take 19 years to undo. It was 1998 when Matthew Shepard, a young gay man, was tortured and murdered near Laramie, Wyoming, just because of his sexual orientation. The night he died, spontaneously, thousands of people stood on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. for a candlelight vigil. A friend called and said they were going, and so we joined them. It was another amazing, moving night of mourning and protest. But as the century came to a close, the ball was rolling toward LGBTQ equality. Oh, in the new millennium, things began to move very quickly. In the year 2000, Vermont becomes the first state to legalize civil unions and register partnerships between same-sex couples. 2003, in Lawrence v. Texas, the U.S. Supreme Court rules sodomy laws unconstitutional. 2004, Massachusetts becomes the first state to legalize gay marriage. In the following 6 years, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Iowa, and Washington, D.C. follow suit. Then California in 2008. In 2009, the Matthew Shepard Act passes in Congress and is signed into law by President Obama, expanding federal hate crimes law to include crimes motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. 2010, the U.S. Senate votes 65-31 to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly in the military. 2011, President Obama states his administration will no longer defend the Defense of Marriage Act. It banned the recognition of same-sex marriage or marriage equality, as activists were now describing it, and the government would not, absolutely not defend that law. By 2013, 80-year-old lesbian Edie Windsor sues the US government because, after her partner died, she wound up paying over $300,000 in estate taxes on her own house. That did it. She was mad. She sued the United States government. On blustering March 27th, 2013, for the Supreme Court's oral arguments in the case, my wife Bonnie and I stood on the steps of the court holding a banner saying, if gay marriage was legal, today would be our 31st anniversary. People cheered us. Youngsters looked at us like we were really ancient, and reporters interviewed us. And Bible-thumping picketers spit at us. Except for the spit, it was a thrill to be there. And of course, being spat at by the infamous Westboro Baptist Church was a milestone. And in June of that year, Edie won her case, and marriage equality became legal in all the states which had already approved gay marriage. Just a short time later, Edie was Grand Marshal of the New York Pride Parade, with an elderly drag queen naming Rollerina roller skating around her, and young gay men bowing down before her rolling convertible as the parade moved down Fifth Avenue. Oh, and in Edie's honor, I got a puppy and named him Windsor. Then, on June 26, 2015, Pride Month, and near the anniversary of Stonewall, with a 5-4 decision in the case of Obergefell v. Hodges, where the US Supreme Court declares same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. We joked. We said it was a good thing Edie Windsor came first, or my dog might have been named Obergefell. But we were legal now throughout the land. There's no federal anti-discrimination law yet, and many cases remain to be decided. And depending on the outcome of the 2020 election, who knows what policy reversals may happen. So thanks for sharing this time with me, folks. We have lots more to do. Please act up and vote November 3rd. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Faye, and to all of you for watching. Again, we want to thank the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, which is the state and federal partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we want to thank Air Products for supporting our cultural programs at Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center. For information about all of our programs, including many, many, many virtual programs that we have going on throughout the pandemic, visit bradburysullivancenter.org/events. And for information about how to stay safe from COVID-19, you can visit bradburysullivancenter.org/coronavirus. Thanks for enjoying LGBT History Month with us, and we'll see you soon.